I'm Nolan Higdon, and I'm one of the conference organizers. And if you came to the welcome keynote panel, you've already heard enough of me. Today, what we'll do is in this panel, we're going to go around to the different presenters. The presenters are going to introduce themselves, introduce their work, and then we hope to have a discussion with all of you. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat too, so if you want to ask questions of the panelists, I'll keep a record of that and make sure we address them as they pop up. So that's kind of the plan. I'm going to turn it over first to Rob Williams. Rob.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Rob Williams on the Vermont frontier here. Really wishing that we could all be together in person, as is usually the case, but circumstances are what they are. So I just sent everyone a link in the chat, and I'm going to be fairly brief. I was asked to talk about backpack journalism, which is the subject of this new little book I put together called Media MOJO, Common Power Tools and Simple Storytelling Strategies for Our Digital Age. And if you're interested in a free e-copy, just send me a message with your email and I'll just pop you a link. What I try to do in the book is distill down a couple of decades of critical media literacy education work that I've been involved with many of you here on the call and lots of people beyond. And I like the metaphor of backpack journalism because we live in this kind of ephemeral age of the digital. And what's wonderful about the backpack journalism metaphor, I think, is that a backpack is like a tangible physical object that everyone, I think every human being, regardless of circumstance, has access to in some way. And you can fill a backpack with all kinds of tools and objects for empowering you as a human to craft your own stories in the company of other sapiens. And journalism, of course, is about asking questions. It's about conducting research. It's about authoring stories. And so that's where kind of the backpack journalism metaphor comes from. I just wanted to share really quick, because I know we're all struggling with how to sort of effectively teach online in this strange time that we find ourselves in. And 4 quick strategies that I mentioned in a previous conversation here today that I've found useful, and I'd love to collect, if people are willing to share those when we have time, what seems to be working for you. I teach in Vermont at a couple of different colleges in what's called a flex hybrid model. So at any given time, I have half of my students in front of me with masks on in the classroom, and another half of my students remotely from various parts of the city of Burlington. And that's been kind of an interesting challenge. But before I get to those strategies, I don't know, Nolan, if you're able to share this link or if I can do it or how that works. But I just wanted to throw up here on the screen. I could just read them too. That might be easy enough. Yeah, if you want to click on the link, friends, I just scrolled down right below the conference visual, the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas there. 3 questions that I've been sort of thinking about as I've been listening to the welcome session, the plenary, and this morning's conversations. The first question with regard to backpack journalism: how do we honor individual team human sapiens storytelling modes of communication? How do we honor those over big tech's digitally surveilled, quote unquote, walled gardens, your Snapchats, your Facebooks, your Instagrams, etc.? Second question: how do we elevate individual team human sapiens storytelling production and publishing? How do we elevate that over consumerism and consumption exclusively? And third question: how do we build team human sapiens storytelling communities beyond the walled gardens of big tech's digitally surveilled walled gardens? I repeated that for dramatic effect. So honor, elevate, and build. And that's really the sort of the subject of the backpack journalism work that I do. And I tried to sort of condense some useful tools for doing that into this little book called Media MOJO. So I'll end with kind of 4 strategies that I found useful over the past 8 weeks. Oh, Nolan, thanks for Samantha, thanks for that, and Nolan, thanks for reposting. I'm just looking at the chat. Yeah, there's a good suggestion. Use the chat to dramatic pedagogical effect, for sure. The first strategy that I found useful with my students is to ask them whether they're in the classroom or working remotely to compile notes. And I usually do it in the form of kind of a fun top 10 takeaway list, but to compile notes from the conversation that we're having in the class that day. And I typically teach two classes per week. So we kind of come up with a 2-column list. And then at the end of the week of classes, I ask them simply to take a picture of their notes on their phones and publish that photo, that image of their handwritten notes and doodlings and drawings. They can do whatever they wish. Publish that to Canvas, and then I review that at the end of the week. And that's kind of a fun way to hold everybody accountable, whether their cameras are on or off. There's a big debate, as I'm sure you know about, should their cameras be on or off. That kind of is kind of an end run around that whole, camera on or off thing in the moment. Second thing is empowering students to take charge every week of driving the conversation around books and films and conversations that we're having with a short presentation. We share them, we give them authorship of the conversation, they share that, and then we have a facilitated group conversation about the reading. And that has worked really well. And every student by the end of the semester will be doing at least one of those presentations. And again, it works whether they're remote or whether they're in the classroom. Third, we've been doing what I'm calling crowd critiqued research projects. So every week, rather than giving students a research project and then collecting it week 16, we actually every week add a new paragraph, a new image, a new element to their project as a weekly deliverable. And then each of those students in the Zoom or in class will share that new deliverable for critique. And we take about 5 minutes to give them some feedback on that. And those students then collect that feedback right on the Canvas and work it into the next iteration of the research. And I found it really helpful for empowering students with regard to A, their own work, and B, really taking ownership of critiquing each other's work. And I found that really, really powerful. And then finally, really using multimedia strategically. So if you're going to watch a film like The Social Dilemma on Netflix, really taking it in small chunks, stopping it, cracking open the conversation, asking students to compile notes, asking questions, etc. And then you watch a film like The Social Dilemma over the course of several weeks as part of the classroom conversation, rather than having them watch it on their own and then come back and maybe you have a single conversation about it or what have you. And finally, I'll end with the idea of backpack journalism. The goal here ultimately is to encourage students to author their own stories in the company of each other and in the company of their own communities, regardless of where they may be, rather than simply kind of playing in these digital spaces that we all know are driven by what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism in her oh so important book with the same title, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And of course, that book has some issues as well, but in the interest of time, I will stop there and mute myself and listen. And again, if you'd like a copy of the free book, just throw me a message in the chat or email me offline or whatever, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thanks, y'all.
Oh, thank you, Rob. Rob, you'll put your email in the chat for everybody, right? Yonty.
Hello, everybody. Very happy to be here. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to walk through it quickly just to introduce. And I'm glad that Rob came before me because it was a great introduction to what I'm going to talk about. So I'm the director of the MA in Civic Media at Columbia College Chicago. And during the spring, we had our practicum. So the practicum is students are going to communities, working with communities, and creating together media that will address a social issue of the community, concern of the people of the community. So obviously they had like a month or so, and then suddenly, whoop, you cannot be in the community. And so what do you do? So I'll go really quickly at what happened there, and talk a little bit about my conclusion and what happened there, and happy to discuss later on. So in general, civic media by Jenkins is any use of any medium that foster or enhance civic engagement, which doesn't say too much, but there is a larger definition that also is kind of vague of Gordon and Mihalidis. But in general, civic media is to take media production for a source of civic engagement, community engagement. And that's basically what we did, but we try to have it more geared toward the community. One small example, so you can see, is something that happened in Illinois, where you can expunge your juvenile record by a lot of bureaucratical process. So what some students did at Columbia several years ago was they created a video game that as you play the video game, you actually fill up all this bureaucracy, because obviously the people who had juvenile record will not go to a federal building or a local state building, start to fill up all this paperwork that fills surveillance and hand it. So that was a great way to, it was so popular that actually the legislator changed the law so that they don't need to go through all this bureaucracy. So that's just an example. That's the best example of civic media, but that's like the high goal if students can achieve. So that's where they were aiming for, and kind of heartbroken that they were not even close to it as the pandemic was hitting them. So Chicago, this is the map of Chicago. This is a map from 2018 and the digital divide. So that's the broadband internet. And as you can see, the more yellowish, the better broadband, the more red, the less broadband internet there. And again, there is issues with that. I'm not going to get into the whole definition of digital divide and what does it mean and the broadband internet and how the differences between South Chicago versus the north of Chicago, because again, there's a lot of research and talking about what does that mean and how does it look like. But just to give you some kind of visual representation. So one group worked with refugees, kids in middle school in Rogers Park. Another group worked with high school students at Woodlawn Charter School, mainly Black youth. One group worked with DACA and Dreamers in Hycher Arcs. Yes, I think that's the name of the neighborhood. That was middle school and high school. One group worked with dropouts that were young adults from West Garfield Park. And one group worked with LGBTQ young adults and seniors trying to do intergenerational conversation through different media tools. So that was their plan. And all of that got totally disrupted by the fact that, as we know, so I'll go one by one quickly. The refugees, the school just told them, nope, you cannot contact them. There's privacy issues. There is concern. You're not going to contact them. And it was totally cut off. They couldn't continue with their work. The Black youth was the only one that was somewhat successful because the student worked already and established trust and was there for 2 years already. So she had their phone number, she had the contact, she knew how to arrange and have them work together. So they kept meeting and talking about what's going on. So that was the only really successful project. The DACA and Dreamers, the school couldn't get a hold of the students themselves. So there are issues with bandwidth, with family that are sick. And still, there is a lot of issues in South Chicago with the Latinx community and the Black community with the access to different resources to really connect with the school or with other people. Dropouts, they couldn't meet in person. And so they moved to create a Facebook group, but that was really difficult because people were not really wanting to engage with them in the Facebook group because at time of pandemic, who cares about now go and put a post on Facebook, we're afraid of our lives. And then the LGBTQ, the young adults totally were not concerned about meeting with the seniors, and the seniors didn't have the digital tools to access like the Zoom. They were trying, they couldn't with the Facebook, they didn't know the password. It totally didn't work to go together. So basically it totally kind of dissolved the project and showed the students the severity of the digital divide, what needs to be done. But at the same time, the students themselves were working with what's going on in their life and were trying to mediate and like, what am I supposed to do? And so each one of them found different ways to connect either with the community in different ways or alternate to another community. But obviously it was very disruptive. And so looking at what happened, I kind of categorize 5 elements that now when I'm looking to get ready for something and kind of in a dialogue with Rob, what you just shared, what are the 5 elements that we need to make sure that something like this doesn't happen, even if we need to go into quarantine? And so when we talk about participatory, is really to work with the community, like in a really participatory, genuine way. Accessible, is it really accessible? Like, how do you do something in a project that will really be accessible and not suddenly you don't have digital divide, you don't have a digital tool, you cannot really access and collaborate with them. Reflective, are you letting your participant reflect to keep you accountable? Because you can say one thing in the beginning and then as you work there, things shifted. So are you open to reflection to really be accountable to what you promise to do there? And impactful, are you sure that the project that you do is actually serving the community in an impactful way and not just theoretically something that you think that they should do? And the last one is it sustainable? Like once you're gonna stop the class, are you gonna actually like keep working, not you keep, but the community will be able to keep working on it. So is it really sustainable the way that you structure it, which obviously was not sustainable the way we did it in the spring. So this is a quote, I'm just gonna end with that. That is like the motto of the program, which I love because I think it's the heart of what I was trying to explain. And now we basically changed the whole program because of that experience to make sure that we're really doing that premise and not just saying, oh, we're going to do service learning. And as the usual service learning, it evaporates and the community feel more hurt than being helped. So that's like really in a short way kind of summary of what I was talking and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Okay. I guess Allison and I will talk about our work next. I'll let Allison kick it off.
Okay, hi, thanks. It's so nice to see all of these faces, even digitally. Although, quite frankly, I'm really looking forward to being back in person whenever that is possible. So Nolan and I are doing something slightly different. I really appreciate Rob and Yonty and their actual engagement with human beings. And then of course the struggles that that's facing right now. What Nolan and I are doing in the work that we're sharing is actually something that was kind of a new direction for both of us. Both of us are really pretty used to working directly with humans, directly with students in classrooms, with teachers, with the actual flesh and blood human beings that are receiving or unfortunately more often not receiving media literacy education, and most often looking at like what that looks like or how it's operated in classrooms. What we did this time in our exploration of corporate media literacy, this is part of a bigger project that we're engaging in over time on what the different lesson plans, activities, curricula, et cetera, of media literacy are coming into classrooms, both from a nonprofit perspective and from a corporate perspective. And what we did to play around with this first was to look at corporate media literacy and ways in which big corporations, Google, Facebook, Verizon, NetPod, which I still quite frankly don't exactly understand what that's about, but okay, are entering into classrooms with supposedly free curriculum, free lesson plans, etc. And so instead of looking at the human reception of this, we're looking at the construction of it And one of the things that we discovered, personally, I feel a little bit naive about this, but I'm super happy that I've kind of gotten up to speed on it, is quite frankly, how long corporations have been in classrooms, right? I mean, we're both a little bit, Nolan, I'm going to speak for you here for a quick second, but we're both a little bit we kind of have our hackles up and are a little bit up in arms about Facebook and Google and all of these big folks getting, kind of maneuvering their way into the classrooms. But we're looking at examples from the 1920s. Ivory Soap was entering into classrooms, giving away free soap, obviously with their brand stamped on it, with lesson plans that had to do with teaching soap carving as an important home economics activity. So this ain't nothing new, right? I mean, this has been going on for ages. In talking with my class, I teach a class on media and education in the fall, and in discussing with my class some of their experiences with corporate culture in the classroom, they're remembering posters advertising reading, which is of course great, but what does it mean when we have an athlete or a celebrity encouraging folks to read? Almost to a fault, every single one of them brought up the Got Milk campaigns. They talked about Gatorade, Gatorade vending machines that were strategically placed right outside of the gym, not necessarily near the cafeteria. Obviously, there were other vending machines near the cafeteria, but that the, quote unquote, healthy drinks or the sports drinks were right outside their cafeterias. So we've seen the corporate in the classroom for an extraordinarily long time. Our goal in this part of this bigger project was to kind of look at, and yes, thank you, Rachel, absolutely, Channel 1, right? Channel 1 is maybe the biggest of this. It is, and I might end up repeating myself a little bit about this, but thank you so much for bringing this up, right? Channel 1 was developed as a way to bring advertising to classrooms. It was disguised as this news program that was supposedly produced with young people in mind, right? We know that regular news is kind of for grownups, as it were, and Channel 1 was quasi-designed to be specifically for young people, but it was about bringing advertisements to the classroom. And the advertisements that were shown in Channel 1 were the same ones that were being shown on MTV. So not that MTV wasn't timely in its heyday, but it certainly wasn't what we might have thought of as straight up news, as it were, right? And the devil's bargain with something like Channel 1 was that it provided much needed equipment, certainly at this time when classrooms were thinking that they needed some of these, at the time, advanced technologies, production equipment, televisions, etc. It provided this equipment, quote unquote, for free, but classrooms were mandated to watch these 10-minute news programs. And I believe they had to check, they had to watch at least 90% over the course of the school year in order for that relationship to be valid. Students have a lot of ways of fighting that. We've certainly read stories of students who just kind of keep their heads down, but the TV wasn't allowed to be off, right? So part of our work here was to kind of explore some of this corporate culture and what does it look like? And who are these corporate folks learning their media literacy from? What kind of media literacy is this? So I'm going to toss it over to Nolan to talk a little bit about our methods and then share with you some of our findings.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. And timing is so weird in this situation because we started this research before the COVID pandemic. But as we were going through this research, a lot of folks who had not taught online before were now teaching online. They were getting bombarded with these advertisements from corporations to use this content. This is the easy transition from what you're used to. So we went out, we tried to hunt down this corporate content. One of the difficulties we ran into is a lot of them don't use media literacy in their description of their content. So we had to look for things like digital literacy and media curriculum and things like this. But we were able to identify content from Apple, Facebook, Google, Nearpod, Intel, Microsoft, Twitter, Samsung, and Verizon. And we found that, at least in the case of Facebook, and Microsoft and Twitter, they worked with nonprofit organizations. And in the case of Google, they said they worked with educational specialists, but we were little skeptical or curious of exactly what that meant. So that's the content that we ended up identifying. And then we took a deep dive, both in terms of looking at what was in the content and doing an analysis of it. But we also, you can complete some courses and get certificates. And Allison in particular liked a lot of the games and certificates you're able to earn from those. So I'll turn it over to her. She can talk about some of the findings we had from this content.
I'm not a huge fan of the word "like" in this situation. I will say that one of Google's lesson plans is you can learn how to be internet kind. This is something we shared on the video that we made. So apologies if I'm repeating myself if anybody had watched that. But to be internet kind, and this is evidently a video game designed for early childhood. I am not video game adept, so it was probably good for me to do something for early childhood, but it still took me like a good half an hour to figure out how to move my little character around. So it took me a long time to get internet kind. But what was curious about it was it's this essentially this like climbing game where you sort of start off at the bottom and you climb up and you get to like this place of kindness. And along the way, you meet these other little characters that are sort of sad and grumpy, and you get to throw happiness at them. You throw like emojis that are hearts or emojis that are smiley faces or so on and so forth. I had a real problem with the fact that to be kind, I was throwing stuff. That seemed a little counterintuitive to me. And then as me, advance in the level, you run across bullies, and it's your job to stop the bullies. And you get a couple of different tools to stop the bullies depending on where you are, because like any video game, you can kind of get bonus things. So you can do something that puts the bully in a cage, which I also had a real problem with, because I think just at the political time we're living in now, no matter how mean you are, putting somebody in a cage doesn't seem really appropriate or responsible to me by any stretch of the imagination. But there was also no tools for exploring bullying, or what does it mean to be a bully. And you could have this megaphone where I guess you were sort of saying kind things, and then the bully would kind of get sad and grumpy, and like the little characters that he was being nice to were, you know, happy, and so on and so forth. And then once you're done, once you get all the way to the top, get a certificate that says that you're internet kind. So yay. But I'm not really quite sure what I learned, to be honest, about kindness. But we wanted to kind of play around with some of this stuff, see what it was like, see what it felt like from the receiving end of it. Certainly, as Nolan mentioned, we started doing this before COVID hit. I would imagine maybe more families are engaging in this stuff now, in part because it is largely, for the most part, free, cost free. In terms of our findings, something that is certainly happening in the 21st century and is certainly happening with the digital resources is this notion of developing marketable skills and training a workforce. But this is nothing new. A lot of these corporations have been doing this easily since the 1980s, that especially technological corporations going into classes and wiring schools or wiring classes, bringing in certain technology are identifying a workforce by seeing how the students are responding to the work. And then that gives them the opportunity for sort of labor outreach. So it's a way of sort of capturing your future employees. One of the things that was definitely 21st century was this notion of creating civil digital communities. A lot of language about connectivity and community collaboration, ways in which to communicate with others, and seems to be this idea of creating some sort of space where we're all gathering together, which I think in some ways is kind of a smokescreen for how isolated these technologies can enable us to be. I think back to some of the stuff from this morning with this idea of, from the conversation this morning, that neoliberalism presents things as personal problems when in fact they are shared concerns. And if there's a lot of language about civility and community, we can actually still ultimately in reality be very much by ourselves. One of the third things we found was this notion of protecting students from harm. And in part, we saw this as, in some ways, a reaction to some of the troubles with cyberbullying, right? I mean, be internet kind, right? But it's always from somebody else, right? There's always this idea that we, this benevolent corporation, are going to teach you this so that somebody else doesn't harm you. All along, all of this, of course, is an extraordinary amount, I mean, an immeasurable amount of data mining, right? Everything that is happening is being learned about these young people. Everything that they're doing in this digital realm, all of their data is being gathered. And yet their identities are sort of fourth major finding here, is that their identities don't really matter, and the identity differences don't really matter. They're sort of lumped together as these kind of homogenous youth users, or maybe family users, or so on and so forth. Facebook and Twitter might have offered the most in terms of a user identity, but there really wasn't any address of who the user might be as an individual. It was this kind of homogenous construction. So those were the sort of big picture things that we found, and I'll toss it back to Nolan to kind of wrap up our discussion and conclusion.
Yeah, I'll just wrap it up quickly, and we can do the rest for Q&A. But essentially found that this content does offer resources and activities we might not otherwise have access to. But there's strings attached. It comes with a neoliberal ideology, and potentially limits the autonomy of students and teachers when this content enters the classroom. We also kind of found that it's a consistent, it's part of the consistent pattern of corporations entering the classroom. We think future research needs to be done on why are the specific decisions made? Like, who made the decision to put the bullies in cages or have you throwing stuff? One that we found most interesting was that some of the content talked about time, cultural, social, and local, regional, and global identities, but it ignored gender, race, sexuality, ability, or class. So what was behind those decisions are the things we think need future research. But I'll stop there, and we'll throw it over to Rachel and Carl.
All right, thanks so much, everybody. My name is Rachel Guldin. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Oregon, and this is Professor Carl Bybee, also from the School of Journalism and Communications at the University of Oregon. So Carl's going to go ahead and introduce what we did, and then I'll just do some follow-up.
Hi, folks. It's good to be here. It's so heartening in these times to be kind of surrounded by some folks who are trying to think critically about our situation and how the media fits into our contemporary situation when we're faced by so many different crises that in one way seem unrelated and in another way seem deeply interrelated. The paper, the presentation that Rachel and I have put together for this panel is actually in some ways kind of inspired by, I think, a lot of concern about, in media education, how do we address the issue of one of our most burning contemporary challenges, literally burning, climate change. And at the same time also recognize that the issue of climate change cannot be disconnected from where the historical moment that neoliberalism has brought us to. I think kind of a big inspiration for the class was, in some respects, the work of not only Bruno Latour, but surprisingly Pope Francis in his Green Encyclical 5 years ago, kind of making the argument that we can no longer think that we can talk about climate change without talking about the economic crisis we're in the midst of. So given that, Rachel and I kind of faced with kind of updating a kind of introductory media education class in the School of Journalism. It's like, what should this class look like, and how do we bring in both climate change and kind of world historic economic inequality, which are the deep context within which media education is taking place? How do we bring those in? Where do we start? Where does the story start? And I think for both of us, there was a strong feeling that the conventional grand narratives for media education, either being organized around kind of a liberal kind of media approach, which kind of traces in a historical narrative the growth of different kinds of media technologies, the printing press, the newspaper, through the internet. That these kind of machine-based approach, it didn't really begin. It set in place. It kind of got our attention directed to the wrong place, and kind of led us, instead of beginning to think, how can we put these things together, continue to offer up this more fragmented understanding of the media society environment connection. We certainly didn't want to just kind of bring environment in at the end. That also seemed awkward. And even when we looked at, in some respects, the media education tradition that I have been most engaged with and inspired by, the kind of critical media tradition, recognizing that even reorganizing a course around the trajectory of kind of the ideological approaches, social constructivism, et cetera, that those also, they didn't necessarily take us to this place where we begin to explore in some kind of deep way the kind of perception shift that we probably need to be making to make sense of the interrelated crises of climate change and neoliberalism, not to mention the additional interrelated crisis of race that is obviously tied to both. So in this thinking, one of the quotes that I really like, and we kind of open up the class with, is by Wangari Maathai. And the quote is, she says something to the effect of, in a few decades, the relationship between the environment, resources, and conflict, the environment, resources, and conflict, may seem almost as obvious as the connection we see today between human rights, democracy, and peace. And one of the reasons why this quote is so appealing to us as kind of an epigram for the class is that from a critical perspective, it's easy to understand the importance of human rights and its intersection with democracy. At the same time, it's still hard to think about, where does the environment and our relationship to the environment fit in here? How do we work it in? So the position that we took instead was, let's begin the story of media and society. Let's shift the story about media education to using an ecological framework, an ecological orientation to our relationship to the environment. As kind of John Dewey said, how do we begin understanding our humanness in terms of being organisms in an environment? So that the ground of the orientation is one in terms of literally how we perceive and understand the interconnectedness with our humanness and the natural world, not as separate, but as deeply interconnected. What if we begin our introduction to media and society, media education, working off of this premise, which is evolutionary, it's ecological, and then raises very different notions about how the media and how communication come into the picture. And from this perspective, then, the media starts to emerge as the means by which both we come into our capacity to interrelate with each other, and the means by which we come into our ability to interrelate with the very planet on which we live. So it really asks us to hold in the foremost of our consciousness this understanding of ourselves as ecological beings, and communication as not only as both a central biological process, and all which we deeply need to recognize and understand, but also as the process that then also gives us the consciousness to be aware of the importance and the character of those biological processes and be able to value them. It also gives us a different way of thinking about technology, or we might call them tools or technology or media, thinking about and seeing and understanding technologies not as communication machines, but as the means by which we have established our capacities to kind of recognize, mark, and make sense of our connectedness to the world and to each other. The means by which our attention through these technologies and the character and quality of these technologies, how our attention is drawn to one place and not another, and how it's drawn to the places that we see in the world. So anyway, our kind of challenge here, our experiment with this class was, what would a media and society class look like if we began deeply with an ecological worldview, which we think is the perception shift we need to make, both in terms of understanding our place in the planet and also how the media relate to the planet. How would this work if we kind of began there and telling the story? So that was our experiment. Rachel.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in quickly here with just a few more minutes before we move to question and answer. So one of the things that I think was most meaningful for our students in this was sort of the way that the class was set up. So we sort of divided the class into two areas in which we really talked about what a mechanistic view of the world looks like, taking a whole and cutting it down and down into smaller atomized pieces that one can make sense of, versus a systems view, which came out of the Capra and Luisi text. What does it mean to have these individual parts and understand them as a whole? And so asking students to see the difference between this mechanistic view and then this parts to whole view, the systems view, was pretty meaningful for them. Ultimately, the way that the class was built had students work individually to do their readings, to do reflections. They worked on small group projects. So it's a class of over 100, and we had them in small groups, which maybe we'll reconsider next time for the overall size of the class. That can be a challenge. And I don't know how it would be attempted in a pandemic era class, but that would need further consideration. However, we took, essentially the students worked individually and worked in groups as a whole in order to sort of replicate that parts to whole systems view, not only in what they were talking about with the media, but in the education that they were getting within the classroom and sharing with each other. Our culminating project for them came out of a series of those small group projects that then resulted in this larger group, in which, or the larger end group project, in which students examined a media entity of their choice. So we had students who looked at social media apps like Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok. They looked at technology like the iPhone 7 or the Apple Watch. They considered platforms like Canvas or Twitch. And then they sort of looked at legacy media. We had one group who just said newspaper. And ultimately, we asked them to interrogate in a variety of interrogate each of these entities in a variety of ways, which included looking at it. What's the mechanistic understanding of this? In what ways does this have material implications for our environment? We asked them to put these ideas together to create a holistic critique of those media entities. So not what does this do for you, but what is the role of this entity within the world and the ways in which we can think through that differently. Happy to answer other questions about that, but I think for right now, I'll toss it back to Nolan for Q&A.
Thank you. I saw a couple of questions in the chat. Does anybody want to ask their questions themselves, or they want me to?
Looks like Nolan got frozen. That's a drag. But while he's still figuring stuff out, I'm happy to sort of take over. I'm seeing questions in the chat, but I also don't want to, some of them seem like they've also been answered in the chat. So my apologies for this. If anybody wants to use the little hand raise function or put a question in the chat, I will kind of start monitoring them. I also just want to say, for some of the stuff that came up when Nolan and I were talking, thank you very much for the link to that article on Channel 1. I find myself doing a fair amount, even though Channel 1 is done, I find myself doing a fair amount of like rage reading about Channel 1. So I love it, you know, like I need more rage reading in my life these days, but thank you very much for that. So again, if anybody has any questions, I don't think I can see everybody just the way that Maya, okay, thanks, Samantha. If you'll re-ask your question to Yonty's about the students' reflections, etc. Do you want me to, now I gotta find where you are. I will happily unmute you.
It's up near the top.
Yeah. So,
oh, sure. Yeah, Yonty, I think you know what I'm talking about, so maybe you could just go for it.
So just to clarify for those who came like later as well. So we had 11 students, and because of the disruption of the pandemic, the work with the community was disrupted, and that was a huge like reflection for them. So for example, one that worked with the refugees, middle schoolers, just left Chicago, also security wise. She was kicked out of the dorms and she went back to her North Carolina community, where it's a community of refugee, and actually work there with the pastor and kind of had the whole community and work on social media to get the community together and connect them while they couldn't meet face to face. So she was really frustrated from the lack of connection in Chicago, but was able to find a purpose and work together in her North Carolina community. So that was one. The two students who work with the LGBT young adults and seniors who couldn't connect with any of them, opened it up and created a board game online. It was supposed to be face-to-face, but they created an online that is now there and had the LGBTQ community come and join and design it with them. So now it exists there. So that was a success from that like story. One of the students who work with the DACA and the Dreamers decided, because she couldn't connect with those students, to start interviewing her own family about her own immigration from Mexico and put it up on Facebook and had people create discussions about that. So basically what happened was that although they didn't feel that they fulfill what they wanted to help with the community they work with, like on the quote that I shared, they were able to self-reflect about what they can do with their own power using media to make a change in their own life with their own community and reconnect with the values that they wanted to put from their own purposes. So civically, it's kind of an issue from my point of view of like the community were not helped. But from the students' point of view, it was helpful as a reflection, as self-actualization to kind of look further, okay, I can still do something. And now when I'm done with the program, I can go back to those community or other communities and really do something, because I do feel that I have the power to make a change and to contribute to story and to voices. So I hope that kind of answered.
Thank you. And thank you for repeating the question, because I'm trying to also go through the chat and see what's up before I miss anything. Can I see hands? Is that you, Rob? Am I seeing your hand?
Well, if there's no one else, I had a question for Rachel and Carl, really for all of us. And Nolan just nudged me to ask it. Is that all right?
Fine by me, sir.
So Rachel and Carl, thanks for the for your meditation there. And I hadn't heard of that Capra book, so I just threw the link to it into the chat. I've been doing a lot of research about, I'm writing a book about yaks around the world and yakking cultures, and it's brought me into this place of looking at how indigenous communities communicate. And I'm really struck, and I think we all know this here, how displacing our digital communications technologies are. And I'm using the word displacing very slowly and deliberately here. So I guess my question is, how do you reconcile our communication technologies, our digital communications platforms, which, you know, McLuhan famously called extensions of man, extensions of humans. How do you reconcile our digital communication technologies with how we as a species, as sapiens, kind of move through our geophysical world? Something I've been thinking a lot about.
Is this okay, Rachel? Can I say something? I think one of the powers of an ecological approach to how we think about technology is that it asks us to think about how each time we direct our attention to the world, we don't simply direct it to the world for no reason. We attend to the world because we have motivations for why and what we're going to attend to. So the world that's revealed to us is always connected to what, how we are living and what we're doing, what our goals and interests, the problems we're trying to solve is. So the world becomes revealed in terms of the way in which we as motivated actors engage with it. And then the way in which we kind of then codify that particular way of engaging the world, those things become our technologies. So, the joke about the hammer, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, well, that's true. I mean, but the hammer is actually is a cultural artifact that stands for and tells us something about how in the past we looked at and chose to engage with the world. And it in that pattern of ways evolved into that particular technological artifact. So the artifact now is not just a tool, it's also a cultural history about how we see and understand the world. And so every time you pick up the tool, you reenact, you reinforce, you recreate that world. When McLuhan talked about the extensions of man, I mean, in some ways, that was kind of nice to think about the media as these technological kind of bionic extensions of our senses. But much less recognized in terms of McLuhan's work was he also talked about the intentions, the INTNSION, the intentions of media, that not only do we use them to reach out, but the media also reach into us, that there is this ongoing continual recreation of ourselves. I mean, I guess the quote he talks about, first we make tools and the tools make us, which begins to capture some of that. But in some ways, an ecological perspective about technology begins to give us a much richer understanding of that constantly ongoing transactional relationship. And I think when you talk about the yaks, I think one of the things is, again, an ecological historical perspective kind of saves us from becoming nostalgic or wanting to go back or retrieve some original authentic world. What it does is it certainly does direct us to the ways in which any group, any cultural group came into their sense of themselves was always in a deep relationship to their environment, and their environment led them to dress, to speak, and to understand, to see in particular kinds of ways. And so when you throw some kind of new technology into the environment, that's just another piece of the world within which they have to make sense of themselves. The world becomes more complex. In many respects, it becomes less of they have less control and it's less of their making, but it also now becomes the new environment.
Carl, may I
yeah.
add something in here? I think in addition to your question, Rob, the question of moving through, how do we reconcile communication technology with moving through our geophysical world? It's also really important, we found, for our students to connect the communication technologies to the geophysical world. And not just the idea of moving through it or space or disconnection, but the reality that these media technologies that we use come out of the earth, that they are not independent of the earth, that they have a physical implication to our planet, and recognizing that the materials that go into them not only come from somewhere, but they also have implications over time, right? Like as we extract the rare earth minerals, that will have implications for the future. So as I was looking at your question, I was like, maybe it's a geophysical temporal question that we should be asking too, with the time and the space and the implications of the technologies that we are so deeply reliant on. I don't know if that actually answers the question, but that's what came to mind.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just writing down a bunch of notes. That's really helpful. I appreciate the depth there. Thanks.
Nolan, do you want to take back over here?
You were doing fine. That's why as soon as my connection came back, I was like, you got this.
Well, it's in the East Coast, it's 4:28. And I think that means we have 2 minutes left. So if there aren't any other, or guess quick questions, maybe we could just kind of take a minute to sort of wrap up, or I'm sorry, something just came up in the chat. I just want to make sure that it's not a question that we're missing. Okay. Yes, I would like to echo what Ruth just wrote about bringing up the point that media tools come out of the earth. Like I find, and again, I'm fully willing to admit to naivete or ignorance here, but I find that can be so easy to forget on a daily basis, right? It can just like, when things work, it's so easy to forget where they come from or what the implications are. And it's when they like don't work, or when we start to see some of the cracks that we really, and by we in this case, I mean me, see the sort of structure of them. So thank you so much for that discussion. With 1 minute left, Nolan, I would just like to say thank you for organizing this panel. It's always a pleasure to work with you. Just so folks know, from the Zoom land, although we're probably all experts at it by now, this is being recorded, but once it's done, the chat disappears. So maybe if folks need to copy things from the chat before we all leave or log off, because it won't stick with the recording. But again, thank you so much, Nolan, for organizing this panel. It was so fun to see so many great faces. I look forward to seeing all of these faces in person this weekend, next year, somewhere fabulous, somewhere safe, and with all of us still being healthy. Nolan, I'm going to make you do the technological ending because I don't know what to do with that. So again, faces were so wonderful to be seen. Thank you all so very much.
Let me just say too, Allison, thank you. If anyone finds themselves wandering through the Shire that is Vermont, you always have a place to stay. Please come visit.
Thank you so much, everybody.
All right, folks, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thanks much.